Happy Thursday, Saga fans. Rodge here, talking some Age of Magic once again. If you pre-order your copy, hopefully it's on its way right now in the post. You might have it in your hands, just like me right here. But today we're going to talk about the different factions, get into some of the flavor, the special rules. I'll discuss a battle board ability for each one, and hopefully that'll help you decide which faction you might be interested in, or what units you need to take if you're playing them, or an inkling of what you're up against if you are to play against these guys. So I'm just going to jump right in. Hopefully this isn't too much of me reading from the book, but the Great Kingdoms is our first one on the docket. So I mentioned the factions in the other ones. These are kind of archetypes, and these could be good or bad guys. Look at your model range, trying to figure out what you want. And I think in Age of Magic especially, you're going to be able to use the same models perhaps for different factions. So example, I've been playing the Lords of the Wild with my Games Workshop Wood Elf models, and it's really defensive, and I'm not super into defensive play. So I was actually thinking about running them as the Horde, so it'd be more like a barbaric version of my Wood Elves out there screaming across the table, kicking butt. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. But each faction has a special lieutenant. It has a special unit type, and then it has a piece of terrain that goes along with it. So I'm going to get into that right now. So the Great Kingdoms, these are meant to be mostly infantry-based armies. They are limited to one monster, a single unit of creatures. So your ranks of elves and such, or imperial guys marching across the table. So the special thing with the Great Kingdoms is going to be their hero choices. So they have a captain lieutenant who has a special we obey that he can use just on regular levy warrior Hearthguard units. Their special unit are actually paladins, and these are essentially two for one hero picks. Armor 5, aggression 5, determination, resilience 1. They have a special rule, heroic, where if they're fighting a monster, they get to double their aggression to 10, and they become resilience 2. So these guys, these are really cool. Definitely monster killers. And I actually played a game against these guys. So between the captain, the paladins, the warlord, you can take a sorcerer. You can have five or more heroes, and they have determination, we obey. There's different sort of radius type spells, battle board abilities for these guys. So you're going to need lots of extra tokens if you play these guys. You need determination tokens, your fatigue tokens, your buff tokens, your we obey tokens, just to keep track of everything going on. That's if you max out on your heroes, which you may very well want to do. But the board does buff a little bit of shooting. So it's got 8 close combat abilities, thereabouts. It does include shooting reactions, so they can be very resilient against shooting. I think there's 3 or 4 ways they can get defense dice against shooting. They have 2 shooting attacks themselves. So they could take a war machine. The levies can take firearms. So I referenced those in a previous video. A special thing they can do also is they can take winged mounts. So these are horses with wings, Pegasi or other critters here. So essentially they count as cavalry, but they're also flying. And they do have some monster buffs here. So we talked about monsters. They're primitive. They cannot be triggered by advanced saga abilities or trigger advanced saga abilities. But if there's orders or orders reaction abilities, those can buff the monsters. And there's 3 different ways to get additional attack or defense dice on monsters on this board. So you might very well consider a monster, even though you can just take 1. So 4 of the battle board abilities do focus around the heroes. So you're definitely going to want to take in some heroes. And I was going to mention a battle board ability called Legendary Hero, but I think I'm going to talk about Warcry instead, because I think this is going to be the most annoying ability that you can use or play against. So this is either a common or uncommon die. It's an activation. Activating unit to charge. The charge unit must close ranks if possible. So that's kind of cool. And discard 2 attack dice each time it triggers a Saga ability or uses fatigue. So either way. So that is a good ability. It burned my butt in the last game. So that is a little taste of what the Great Kingdoms have to offer. Now, I did mention that each faction has a specific piece of terrain. So this is completely official. You can put down this piece of terrain if you're playing this faction when you're setting up terrain. And each one does a different kind of thing. The ranges on them are usually very short to short as far as its effects go. So it's impassable. It's just a small impassable piece of terrain. So for the Great Kingdoms, for example, it's a memorial. If you have a unit 8 figures or more within very short of the memorial and no enemy units are within short of it, you can reroll one of your Saga dice during your orders phase. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but generally you got to be pretty close to them and to really do anything. So in Age of Magic, there's a really expanded legendary units section. There's 2 legendary units for each faction. And there's 2 legendary war bands that essentially mix up the entire, way that you build your force, and usually has some kind of army-wide rule. I'm going to touch on these real quickly. I'm not really going to get into them. They are still, I don't know how you want to word it, unofficial. You need your opponent's permission to use these, but if you're building an entire army around these, hopefully you've worked it out with your buddies ahead of time, and you're going to be able to get some games in those. So legendary units for the Great Kingdom is the Conclave, which is sort of like a unit of wizards, which is pretty cool. And then the Incredible and Extraordinary Machine, so a steam tank or something crazier. It goes around shooting stuff. There's Sapphire Elves, legendary warband, which they can, they're a little better at using magic than other folks. And then there's the Order Militant, which can get these fanatic troops, which are pretty cool. They're kind of like mini berserkers, armor 3, aggression 2. So yeah, that's about all I'm gonna say about the Great Kingdoms, because otherwise this video is going to be incredibly long. So I'm going to move on to the Lords of the Wild. So as far as army choice, they can take essentially as many creatures as they want. Two monsters. Their Hearthguard and warriors can be mounted with composite bows, which is pretty cool. And the Hearthguard can take bows, period. So I don't think in any faction of Saga you see a Hearthguard with bows. So, and you very well want to take them in this faction here. So their special lieutenant is the Ranger. If he goes into uneven terrain, it counts as open terrain for everybody else. Their special unit is a Swarm, which is a unit of Levy, which are tiny little creatures. You can only take one of them. They're kind of fighty guys. They can go into terrain without penalty. They're hard to shoot, and that's about it. They have javelin type attacks. So just kind of an interesting modeling opportunity. I don't know if I'd specifically build them after playing a few games with them. So the Lords of the Wild battle board. So we looked at it in that little teaser report. There's 3 shooting attacks. There's 4 melee type abilities. And then I would say there's 3 disruption. So the shooting attacks are really, really awesome. The melee ones are interesting. They typically have 2 effects. And the idea is there's a buff for your archers, essentially, and then a different buff for your Hearthguard or your creatures or your fighting units. So they're not super great abilities. Compared to some of the other factions. So they just kind of give you a little buff. The disruption abilities are quite cool. Looking through all the battle boards, there isn't a lot of those type abilities, so I guess these guys have the most. Obviously, they have the ability to turn small units of terrain into titans, so that's pretty awesome. one thing that's interesting is there's no hero specific stuff, and then there's no monster buffs actually. You can always do a magic with these guys, which I'm not even going to get into. We talked about it a little bit last time. But there really isn't a way to buff your monsters compared to some of the other factions. So that's kind of interesting, something I've been thinking about as I've been playing games against other folks who do have ways to sneak on defense and attack dice. So I think the monsters are still worth it, even if you cannot give them any buffs. Being able to take 8 wounds without removing a model from the board, that's pretty useful ability. So yeah. Sharpened Arrows is the ability that I'm going to talk about. So this is a rare dice. You can discard 1 to 3 of your shooting dice, and the enemy suffers an automatic hit for each one you discarded, plus 1 on top of that. So if you discard 3 dice, you get 4 automatic hits. So you're always going to want to discard as many as you can, assuming you have at least 3 dice, so which does require a bigger unit. So it gives you a little taste of their shooting prowess. And the legendary units for these guys, you got the Hunter and the Great Hunt. So it's like a hero with a couple companion type Warhound fellows with him. The other legendary unit is a unit of shapeshifters, which are pretty cool. You can basically write down a little piece of paper, hide these guys in various units, and then when they get into close combat, it's like, boom, there's a werebear there ripping you up. And they have aggression 5, so they can make some really interesting scenarios for your games if they think they're going into archers and this big werewolf pops out. So very cool. The legendary warbands of these guys, the Minotaurs of the Black Hills. So this is a kind of a creature-based warband. And then you have the Arachnean Jungle, which is spider-based kind of guys. They have venom. They can ride spiders. I touched the sacred ground. So the special unit for the Lords of the Wild is the Primitive Totem. At the end of your activation phase and before the end of your turn, every unit within very short of the sacred ground suffers a fatigue if you have a unit within very short of the Primitive Totem, which generates a Saga die. So that's kind of similar to some of these other ones. You got to get pretty close, as I said, to trigger the effects. So let's move on. I've talked about the Lords of the Wild enough already, I feel. So we're moving on to the Undead Legion. So this faction is very cool. I think you need to play some games. It's one I haven't been able to play against yet, so I cannot speak to how effective or amazing they are, but they are really cool. They have some cool options here. So you can take a Necromancer as your warlord. Basically, you just, instead of a warlord, you can take a sorcerer. For the most part, he's essentially the same. He can ride a beast. That's cool. That's nice. That's something to think about there. So in other factions, the warlord is the warlord. You cannot swap out for a sorcerer, so that makes sense for these guys. Their lieutenant is the Black Knight, which is very cool. Once per turn, when a friendly hero should suffer a fatigue, you can choose to inflict it on the Black Knight instead. So the Black Knight, that's pretty cool. He's kind of a fighter, but you want to have him hang back. Maybe buff your Necromancer, or actually this would be great if you did take a regular warlord to make him a fighty warlord. Get out there, kick butt. So the levy for the undead are the mindless. So you get 20 of these guys, 4 of my little 5-finger hands. For 1 point, you can build units of 12 to 24 of these guys. So these replace your levy completely. You don't have the option for regular levy. They're armor 4, which is amazing considering the number of bodies. So these are really more tar pits necessarily than fighters. Their aggression is 1/5. So you need 5 guys for 1 attack dice. There's no shooting aggression. So if you take 24, I guess that's 5 attack dice, I believe. So they are mindless, so they can only be activated by advanced saga abilities or your warlords we obey. And they are mindless, they're slow, so they move and charge a distance of short. And I believe I read that they do not get fatigue, but I cannot see that now. Okay, don't hold me to that. The sacred ground terrain for the undead is the crypt. And whenever you trigger necromancy, a saga ability on a unit within short of the crypt, they get to add an extra number of figures to it. So the battle board for the Undead Legions, how's this one looking? So it's actually a mix. There's 2 movement type abilities, so these are activations. So this is what you're going to use on your mindless. You actually have what I would say 3 healing type abilities. So 1 removes fatigue, which is actually going through the battle boards. There aren't a lot of abilities that remove fatigue. This might actually be the only one on any battle board. I cannot think of one right now, but so don't hold me to that. But it's very uncommon in Age of Magic to be able to remove fatigue, but there are some spells that can do it. There's 2 abilities that will heal troops. So one is board wide and basically add a guy. Other one mainly targets the mindless and warriors. So the undead warbands will mainly be composed of mindless or warriors because a lot of the abilities affect them solely. But you do have 4 attack type abilities, and you do have a disruption ability. There's no specific monster buffs, even though you can take a monster. The one ability I want to talk about is Howling Pack, which is a pretty cool ability. It's 1 common dice, and if you outnumber your enemy, you gain 1 extra attack per figure, but you also get a -1 to your defense dice. So if you're thinking 24 of your mindless, that could be pretty amazing. But remember, there is I think in the specific, the right, it's like, yeah, remember there's a cap to your bonus dice. So you can only double your attacks. So just keep that in mind. It's not going to give you 20 attacks, but that's how you can fight with the mindless, is that Howling Pack ability. So the legendary forces for the undead here, you can take a unit of specters, which are pretty cool. They're incorporeal, and so they don't actually, you can't fight them. So I'm sure the creator Alex was, it doesn't make sense that you can fight specters in other games if they're supposed to be incorporeal. So they kind of move around, and they can move through units and inflict fatigue on them, and eventually they'll kind of just disappear once they've done whatever they're going to do. The other legendary is the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which these guys are amazing. They're 2 points, and I think they replace your Warlord. There's 4 of them. They're armor 5, aggression is 2, but there's various buffs. So each one of the 4 Horsemen has a special rule. And these guys are nasty. And if you actually lose this unit, you automatically lose the game. But these guys are nasty. I could spend a good 5 minutes talking about them, so I'm just gonna avoid that. So the legendary warbands are the royal dynasty of Nephrin Ka. So these guys can take chariots essentially. So your Games Workshop Tomb Kings. And then you have the Carrion Realm, which are undead kind of ghoul eaters. So that's meant to sort of be your ghoul kind of undead warband. So very cool. I'm looking forward to playing some games with those guys. That should be really fun. Games Workshop undead models are obviously amazing looking. So moving along to the Horde. So these guys are very cool, representing your more barbaric forces in the Age of Magic. Your champion is a melee aggression of 6 instead of 4 like other lieutenants, but he's also subject to pride, so he's just a fighter. The special unit is war chariots, so these count as heroes, and they're pretty badass. They're 8 aggression on the charge if they don't have fatigue, otherwise they're 4. And the sacred ground for these guys is a sacrificial stone. All Horde units fighting within melee, within short of the stone, are invigorated to get a bonus attack die. So the Horde board obviously is about close combat. They have 7 close combat type abilities, leaning towards attack dice. They have 2 movement abilities, which are great, and then they do have a shooting defense ability. They've got 1 hero only type ability, and they have 4 ways to buff monsters, plus the Lore of Metal, which has a bunch of buffs in that. So you can only take 1 monster with these guys, but that could be one really fast, nasty monster. So I would definitely recommend mulling that over if you are playing the Horde. The ability I want to talk about is pretty cool. Follow My Lead. It's a common and rare. It's for a hero only. If you win this melee, so it doesn't actually give you anything when you use it, but if you win this melee, all your units get 2 bonus attack dice and 2 bonus defense dice for the rest of the turn. So that's pretty awesome. So that works on the monsters. That's one of the buffs I was talking about. So fun little ability there. Legendary units for the Horde. They can take a war monster, which is costs 3 saga points. It's an enormous creature of some kind with a platform on the back. It's armor 6, aggression 16. That's amazing. Costs a unit of 12 Hearthguards when calculating victory points. And it goes around shooting and freaking people out. The other legendary unit are the Berserkers, which are Hearthguard. Basically similar to your Viking Berserkers. Armor 3, aggression 4. They have determination and they are destined to die, so they do not inflict a fatigue on your buddies if they are destroyed within short. And if you're using these, you can take multiples of these guys, up to 3 units. The legendary warbands, one of them is this Room's Ruffians, which read through it, it's supposed to sort of be more like a orc type warband. There's a Who's the Boss rule, you annoy me. And then there's Moral Island, which is an entire warband of monsters. And every turn you pick one of them to be the warlord essentially, and then he can use abilities. So very cool. Some cool options there for an entire monster warband. So definitely consider that when you're putting these guys together. All right, we're going to get into the Otherworld, the demons. So there might have been some tidbits in the prior battle report. Their special lieutenant is the Conjurer. So he can sacrifice a model within very short, and you get to roll 2 saga dice and add 1 of them to your board. So one thing is there's no levy in the Otherworld. These are kind of demonic forces, so you're not going to have any shrimpy type fellows. The special unit is the Hunters, which I talked about. They're armor 3, aggression 1, but they get 2 aggression when they charge, and they can charge up to a long. So these are going to be speedy warriors. You can promote up to half of your warriors to these Hunters, and you can also, you have a special ability called Wing, which is any hero, Hearthguard, or warrior units in your warband may be winged, and they get the flight special rule, just straight out. They cannot have heavy weapons, but otherwise you can take an entire warband of flying troops, which is pretty cool, especially considering they could just be infantry models, not even necessarily monsters, although you probably might want to take a monster or 2. And their sacred ground is an unstable portal, which can attack enemy models within short at the end of the turn. They roll a dice. On a 6, a tentacle pops out and sucks one of them in. So something like that. The Otherworld board is very cool. It's got actually two kind of attack abilities. That one is like a rift type thing, which uses the long template, and then one of them gives your unit a breath attack, which is a medium range. It's got 7 close combat abilities, kind of slanting more towards defense. Actually, they got a disruption and a movement ability as well. One of the abilities is hero only, and they have a couple different ways to buff monsters, but I'm going to talk about the special battle board ability, which is very cool, called Portal. This one is a rare dice, and you move a unit with no fatigue anywhere on the table in an open terrain, and you place it medium from an enemy. So it's not over medium, it's exactly medium, but that unit cannot move or charge later this turn. So if it's exactly medium, that means you could do a breath attack or use the board ability to do a breath attack. You can cast spells, and then there's that rift ability to kind of beat up the enemy a little bit before they have a chance to charge you. So something to keep in mind, but very cool, kind of themey, magical type ability for those guys. They're legendary units. One is the Archdemon, which is like a giant demon prince, so it's a fighter, but also casts spells. And then the other one is the Avatar, which is a super gigantic monster that takes 2 points. He's armor 5, aggression 16, and he can take a special kind of a sub trait. There's 6 different abilities of those, and one of them is he has resilience 3 instead of 2, but his movement is reduced to short. So that is one of the options there. So the legendary warbands, one is the Tide from the Depths, which is interesting. You don't have a warlord or any heroes. You can't have Hearthguards. You can't have wing units or heavy weapons. So you're limited just to monsters, warriors, and creatures. And so you play a game, and then whenever a warrior unit gets destroyed, at the start of every one of your turns, you roll a dice for each of your warrior units that are killed. And on a 6, you just place them on the board edge, and they keep going. So it's kind of a horde type army, which I've got probably, my demons were meant to be a Games Workshop Warhammer army. So in the time of the horde units, I probably have at least 60 or 70 demon models, demon infantry. So I can definitely run this warband and see how it goes. The other one is the Theocracy of Quantang, which is I guess they're meant more to be kind of humans, but they can get special demon armor, demon helm, and a demon weapon. So that's pretty cool. And finally, let's move on to the Masters of the Underearth. So these guys can actually take 2 war machines versus everybody else, which can only take 1 and often has a limitation of some kind. Their warriors can be equipped with firearms, which is pretty cool. They cannot have flying creatures, though, and are limited to a single monster. So the special lieutenant for these guys is the Alchemist, who is basically you can lob potions and bombs and stuff up to a range of L, which is amazing. And so he's going to get 2 plus a D3 shooting attack dice. And if the unit suffers a fatigue, suffers a casualty, they'll take a fatigue. So kind of similar to the Naphtha bombers from Age of Crusades, but not identical. And then their special unit are these destruction teams, which you can swap out 2 warriors, and you can get up to 2 of these. And they're little. They go on a single base, but then they have firearms, and they kind of have more shooting attacks than they should. So they're armor 3, 4 in shooting, and aggression 1 in melee, and they have 3 shooting dice with firearms. You can kind of have these little extra fireman teams. And then there is a ability that'll kind of activate multiple units, so you're not wasting a lot of Saga dice on these guys, because they do not generate, but they do have resilience 1. So they're going to be tough to remove these little units. And I'm not sure if you want to because of the small damage output, but every once in a while they're just going to roll 3 hits on you. And if they're close, they can cause a fatigue with the firearm. So very interesting little units here. So their Sacred Ground is actually 2 pieces. It's an underground network. And you place them on the board, and if you move within very short, you can kind of pop between the 2 using the underground network. But it's similar to the portal, where I believe you're kind of done, or no, it replaces a maneuver. Sorry. So if you want to learn more, get your copy of the book. So their battle board naturally has a little mix of everything. There's a couple movement abilities. There's 4 attack, close combat type things, 1 shooting attack only, 1 shooting defense, and then a couple disruption things. They have 2 ways to buff monsters, and they do have the Lore of Metal, which I mentioned with Horde, has really great buffing ability. So I'm going to talk about their special ability called Chasm. So this is another really magical type ability, and it's 2 rares. It's an Order's Reaction, and you place a medium ruler on the table, and they encourage the player to build their own little chasm marker. But it has to be more than very short from anyone and in the open. It counts as low impassable terrain. And at the end of the turn, each non-flying unit within short of it takes d6 casualties, and then it's removed from play. So that's both sides. So you're not going to put it next to your own guys, but that's definitely going to create a no-go zone in front of whatever the heck you want. So very cool ability. Very good way to protect your shooting units, but going to encourage the opponent to take some flyers for sure to be able to get over that. So the legendary units for the Masters of the Under-Earth is the Burrower, which is a mobile war machine that kind of digs up and it can actually transport guys, which is amazing. The other one are the Mutant Aberrations, which you can upgrade a unit of creatures to be even more ridiculously buff. Now, Armor 5, Aggression 6, and you remove a fatigue at the end of each of your turns with these guys. Yeah, it could be a really nasty 3 or 4 pack of guys. Legendary warbands, the Dwarves of the Silver Heights. So the special things with dwarves, they do move short, but they charge medium, and then their fatigue limit goes up to 4 for these guys. So that's kind of their special thing. And then you've got the Vermin. So this could be your little goblins or obviously the Skaven. And they kind of have different unit choices. So they can take those Mutant Aberrations not as a legendary unit. So they become a standard part of the list, which is probably the main reason you would take these guys. They do have some other limitations going on there. So that goes through each of those factions, and hopefully you got a good taste. I tried to not make this video too long, and hopefully I succeeded. Maybe not, but I'm really excited for Age of Magic. I played several games more Saga than I've played in a long time, and everybody in our local area is excited for it, and I'm excited to play these different factions and see what they're all about. And see, one thing I'll be curious to see is if there's going to be one specific way that you can play a faction that's going to end up better than the other ways. So for the Great Kingdoms, is taking all heroes going to be the best thing to do all the time. So it's like all the Great Kingdoms warband's going to end up like that at the end, because there's only 6 different archetypes. So it would be really upsetting if that did happen, because that would really cut down on the variability. But given the unit choices and different ways to run things and the different magic spells and lores you can take, I kind of don't think that's going to happen. But I will be curious as we go along here if the different war bands, if you end up seeing the same thing over and over, because that would be a shame. But give me your thoughts in the comments below, and I will try to answer them. Hopefully you've enjoyed this series. I'm going to take a little break from Thursdays here, but I'll be back in May with another video for sure. And maybe it'll be Battleport. I don't know. Maybe we'll get back to the historical stuff. I've got a couple faction reviews in the pipeline here that we're going to get to, a couple guests. So yeah, it's a busy month for Saga Thursday here, but I hope you appreciated these videos, and I'm going to catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.
Saga!